Hi, and welcome to History Respawned. I'm your host, Bob Whitaker. On today's episode, we are returning to Discovery Tour Viking Age. Only this time we are joined by our old friend, Dr. Daniel Melleno. Dr. Melleno is an assistant professor of medieval history at the University of Denver, and he specializes in the history of early medieval Europe and the Viking Age. Daniel was our historical expert for our original episodes covering AC Valhalla, so it seemed only natural to have him back on to look at this version of Discovery Tour, which, if you don't know, is designed by Ubisoft to be educational, and it relies really heavily on the work of scholars during development. So, Daniel, welcome back on History Respawned.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. So a pleasure to chat with you again.
Yeah. So, Daniel, we have got a look here at the quest line for Discovery Tour. And I don't know if you played any other versions of Discovery Tour, but this is the first one that has got kind of a storyline that goes through all of these tours. And so in previous versions of Discovery Tour, it had simply been like a museum-like experience where you would kind of walk up to basically a Codex prompt, and you would get some knowledge about pyramids or about the Peloponnesian War for Assassin's Creed Odyssey. But this one attempts to give you a narrative and player characters to follow along with. And so Daniel and I decided that we would play through this first of these quest lines, just in case anybody out there hadn't played through this storyline yet. We didn't want to spoil what happens later on. So, as you can see here, it's got a description, and this is following the storyline of Thorstein and Gudhilda as they are making their way in Norway as they're setting up for Thorstein's first raid in 866. So let's go ahead and jump into this.
I find it interesting that they stick the name of a historian who has presumably vetted this to some extent.
Yeah,
right there at the too.
Yeah, and so that is a good point because that was one of my complaints about previous iterations of Discovery Tour. There had been one for the Ancient Egypt game Origins, and then one for Odyssey on Ancient Greece. And, there was a very clear sense in which they had borrowed work from scholarship and relied on scholars for the creation of those Discovery Tour modes, but they hadn't actually cited the scholars. So this one, it comes out and just kind of lays it all out there and gives you a specific scholar that advised on the creation of this certain section of the game. So I think that's nice. I think it's nice.
Yeah, it's interesting to consider. I've done a little bit of this sort of consulting work, and it's interesting to consider how much they actually take into account what the historians say. Like from my experience, you produce a lot of material, and then they, sort of smile and nod at you.
Do you have any questions for me before I leave?
No.
This is interesting right off the bat because here we have a slave, a churl, or I guess it would be a thrall rather, right? And the relationship's fairly friendly and chill. I found the whole thing really fascinating, right? Because you spend the whole game as this Viking, like really explicitly a Viking, and here the first thing you start off with is like marriage and family stuff. A lot more like a saga in some ways than the actual main story does, which is kind of cool.
Yeah,
and the fact that you can play as her later, spoiler alert.
Oh yeah, whoops.
Kind of interesting.
No, I'm sure you can imagine if you were watching this, it probably comes up eventually. So this is one of the original game environments. So this is pulled straight from the main game, but obviously the kind of gameplay aspects from the regular version of AC Valhalla have been taken out. You don't have to worry about combat.
Which is kind of hilarious. Like, don't worry. I love the intro, which we didn't watch, but when you get the whole thing started, it's very sort of like, and don't worry, it's all perfectly safe.
And so you get to play around and interact with these game environments without actually having to worry about being murdered or having to scale walls, even though you can still do that here if you want to.
There's some fun moments when you play as a monk where suddenly you're a monk climbing up to the top of the cathedral, and I can only imagine how your abbot would feel. Um, so this interactive system is really interesting to me, right? The way that they essentially make it educational. Um, you click in here, and this is like such a perfect example, I think, of um, the the weird balancing act that this entire game, and I think the entire conceit of doing these historical games has to figure out, which is this is a map of a place called Kaupang, which is basically one of four major emporia, or like basically what we would call urban centers in Scandinavia during the Viking Age. Like, and this is a big deal for a number of reasons, not least of all because it's the first, like, what we would call towns in Scandinavia as a direct result of Viking stuff, right? So this is in Norway, but it is not Stavanger, which is not in any way, shape, or form an emporia in the 9th century. They used it because they needed some sort of like inspiration for what a Viking Age settlement would look like, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's this interesting balance of historical reality, but then sort of, I don't know what the right word is. Twisted sounds too negative.
No.
But like sort of transformed or like
adaptation.
Adapted to meet their needs. And the game is full of this stuff. And it was really interesting in this discovery tour to get to see the places where they actually make these decisions. Right?
Yeah, I think that was my favorite part of this mode because in previous iterations, they had really done these interactive menus and these interactive sections as just straight history. And so it would have been, for AC Origins and Odyssey, it was really kind of encyclopedia entries on, particular aspects of, whatever life was going on in the ancient world in either of those games. But in this one, like you said, they kind of pull back the development curtain and kind of give you the guts of these decisions of historical adaptation. And I think it's fascinating as a historian to see that, but it's also fascinating as a fan of historical games to kind of see the development process unfold through these.
Yeah, I think at some point we can maybe find some of the behind-the-scenes ones also, because those are interesting. The only other thing I would say about this is that it really does emphasize the difference between academia and entertainment, because I would and would have to pay good money to have that good a map, right, for my PowerPoints or for my book that I'm working on. And of course, that's just like par for the course for them. They have all these artists professionally developing these wonderful resources that historians would like.
I know. I mean, we could spend a whole podcast just talking about how much images cost in academic books. I mean, It would just, people would not believe it. They would just not believe it.
Right, and here they just have all of these beautiful pictures and beautiful artist renderings. And it really is like, oh, I want those. Here we go. Historical accuracy versus compelling gameplay.
Creed Valhalla is based on an existing city, also called Stavanger. To reconstruct it, level designers and artists used maps, pictures, and drawings by archaeologist Jean-Claude Gauvin as references, adding alterations for gameplay purposes. While not all the towns resembled Gauvin's drawings, some iconic details helped give a Scandinavian signature to the towns and settlements of the game, easily recognizable by players. Narrow streets, docks, and a salient longhouse in the distance, they all incite exploration and the need for adventure.
I found it really interesting that they chose to give the behind-the-scenes ones a narrator, whereas the sort of academic ones don't have a narrator.
Yeah, and so here's my thought on that, because in previous versions of Discovery Tour, I might be wrong about this, but I think all of the entries had narration. But this game has many more entries, behind the scenes entries, and then also historical entries. And I think, with this decision for the behind the scenes entries to have narration, I think that kind of reflects a little bit of navel gazing. I don't want to be too critical, but these behind the scenes sections, these are talking about primarily the game development side, whereas the historical entries are kind of based on scholarship and historians. And so I kind of feel like, for the game developers themselves, they'd be very interested in highlighting their work as developers in these behind the scenes sections, making those look as good as possible, and then kind of leaving the historical entries as just kind of text. That's my view on it, at least.
Yeah, it's interesting also because I feel like they really chose sort of a cheeky narrator voice for this. And there are a couple of moments as you're listening to these where you realize that what the narrator is basically saying is like, hey, it's a game. Relax. Right? There's a couple entries about like the weather, which is a noticeable thing that many historians commented on when this game came out. That like, boy, Norway sure does seem to be in some sort of like ice age, given that it's supposed to be the sailing season and there's snow everywhere, you know. And they explain that like, well, we wanted to have this distinction between Norway, which was cold and dreary, and beautiful England. It's okay because it's a game.
Yeah.
Right. Like, okay, you could get away with that, I suppose. And it's fascinating to see them make that decision and be explicit about it.
Yes. And, you know, and again, I think that's the kind of detail that, as somebody who plays a lot of these types of games, you know, I've never gotten before. You know, it's often only years after the fact, talking to developers, you get kind of like information about, well, why did they make this decision about this certain historical figure? Or, you know, why did they make this decision about, you know, the way they presented this environment? And so in this game, you get a behind the scenes look at that. And so I find that fascinating. I don't know how many other players find that fascinating, but somebody who's spent years covering, nearly a decade covering historical video games, it's really a great insight.
Yeah, I think that is, I agree, because again, I do that as well, and I talk to my students about it. And when you ask, you know, you mentioned some questions you'd have, one of which is, how do you use this whole thing in the classroom? Well, I think that's actually, for me, the most compelling part, is studying and using it to get glimpses into how designers and people and audiences are expected to interact with this. Right? Like the history stuff, like, okay, I could do this in a PowerPoint lecture. Right? But the sort of behind the scenes stuff is actually really interesting to get a glimpse of like how game design shapes presentation. Yeah, it's we sort of moved past a moment there that I think is worth highlighting also, that again, like the main game has some interesting sort of wrinkles to the standard like our Vikings thing, in as much as there's settlement building and like conspiracies and all that kind of stuff. But this really is like, here, let's talk about weaving, right? And like disputes and stuff, which the main game doesn't have.
Yeah.
I find that really fascinating that they've centered it so much on this woman and her experiences, and somebody who is not yet a Viking in his experiences. And you actually don't get to do any of the Viking stuff with him.
Yeah. He does go on a raid, but it happens off screen, you know, and so it's like the before and after of his raiding years. And, you know, I'm sure we can imagine.
I think that really is something that you don't get a lot of when you think about quote unquote Vikings. But like, she's not a Viking.
Yeah.
She is a, you know, free woman and a householder and a craftsperson. And she is in relationship to Vikings, as so many Norse people were. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is a Viking. And of course, they still use the term Viking pretty much everywhere, but so does everyone.
Yeah. They've got all these great image credits here, and I think it's fascinating. They also include the archival reference for this as well.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, well, okay. Well, let me jot this down. I can go when I get to the archives. You know, I'll go check this out, or I'll go check out the image at the very least.
Yeah, the Nat Museum of Denmark is amazing. Like both physically amazing if you ever have a chance to go, but also they have a huge digitized collection online that you can work through, which is a gift. Like there's so much stuff on their website to look at. And really high quality stuff. We've got a lot of screaming in Old Norse going on in the background.
Yeah, Bjorn is kind of the de facto baddie in this storyline.
I did find it interesting when he started popping up in other storylines. The way that they weave this together is really interesting. It's interesting. The story, I don't know if it's the most compelling because of the sort of limitations on it. Like you sort of hop in and hop back
He
out.
would make me rescue
Um,
you, and then we would all be
But
doomed.
it's interesting that they went to the trouble to craft this sort of, I don't know if it's mundane exactly, but like lower stakes, more grounded
Banal.
game.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does have a feeling of like the Icelandic sagas to a certain extent, which sometimes there's very high adventure in the Icelandic sagas, but also there's lots of sort of like stuff that you sort of, I don't know if slog is the right word, but that you work through, and it's much more slice of life and mundane than you might expect from the sort of way we treat Vikings.
Yes. Yes. And I think it's interesting as a game player, it kind of gives you a look at the inner world or potential inner world of non-player characters. Because, when you're playing through these action adventure games, you're just kind of running around, murdering people and, getting into hijinks and, worried about great politics and, stealing horses and stealing longships. And here it's kind of like, oh, well, what are the people who are just kind of like walking around? What are they doing? What are they up to?
Yeah. It is, and it's a very interesting approach. It's hard for me to know if it works exactly because I don't know if this is actually fun per se. Which I don't mean that as a dig. Like, it was interesting, and I spent several hours sort of doing it, and I'll probably finish it. But like, it is so on rails to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm.
That it does, it reminds me of like, I have a 4-year-old, so he's not quite old enough for good video games yet. And so you go to the library and you play like whatever on rails thing they have there to learn. It's better than that, but like there is still that element of like, well, you can pre-explore also, but mostly it's just sort of walking around neighborhood.
Yeah.
Tell me, did Bjorn accept any wares these past few days?
Well, and I think about this with relation to how I present primary sources in class, and I feel like, when I do primary source work with students, a lot of it is about kind of creating a narrative around the primary source. A lot of the, I'm a modernist, and so a lot of what I'm, giving to the students are letters and diary entries and, that kind of look at the inner life of major historical figures. And a lot of that comes with kind of creating a narrative about where this source came from, what's the context of it, and then what happens after this source is written. And I feel like you can kind of see some of that happening here, but it's just much more detailed, obviously.
Yeah, and it is conceptually interesting to think about how this would then translate into a primary source.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because you wouldn't get this much detail.
Yes. Yes.
Right? And so that is kind of an interesting element of it. And they address that to a little bit of an extent, especially in the English ones.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's jump into one of those. We could go to, I guess, number 5, or we could go to number 2. We could get a look at the life of a monk, daily monk.
Yeah, let's go to number 2 because I have some thoughts on what they've done here.
All right. So sorry, Thornstein, you'll have to deal with your oath breaking on your own.
Oath breaking. You're patently very easy to deal with. It is interesting. I mean, like, because they play fast and loose with stuff, of course, like because of the gamification, the way that he should clear himself in all of these sort of early medieval systems is basically to get a bunch of people to say like, no, Thorstein is a good guy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all about reputation and honor and vouching for, right? Like there's very clear systems for that. And instead, because it's a game, you have to have this sort of wit of, battle of wits sort of thing, which is fine. It's just interesting that like, it's not actually how a legal dispute would have occurred necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
So here we have a beautiful Romanesque monastery that is
gorgeous.
2 centuries early, or 2 centuries out of date, essentially, which they even admit at one point. There's an entry where they note that this is actually a French 12th century monastery. She's like, what? Because, of course, we have nothing. We have, like, that's one of the most frustrating things about doing early medieval history in particular as a teacher is, like, if you want to find a good manuscript, you're out of luck. Like, there's lots of manuscripts, but they're all writing. If you want illuminated manuscripts, there's a very limited selection. Some of them are quite beautiful.
Thank you.
You know, like, I mean, the Lindisfarne Gospels are amazing, but compared to what's coming out of the 12th and 13th century, you know, or if you want to know what Lindisfarne looked like in the 8th century, you're basically out of luck because they kept building over it. Right?
Yes.
So it's fascinating to see the challenges that they have depicting a medieval Viking Age world, right? And here is one of those places where they were like, we want a good monastery to run around in. So we're going to go with a 12th century Romanesque monastery because that's more fun and visually appealing than probably a much smaller, you know, less impressive thing would have been.
Yeah. Well, and you know, I mean, so much of the work of these developers is about meeting player expectations. And, you know, it's not that they're not aware of the historical record. And, you know, as you can see in the behind the scenes segments, they're pretty aware, right? And they talk to scholars.
Right.
But it's about, you know, having a fun environment to play in, but then also, you know, meeting the expectations of what people expect the medieval world to look like. Or, you know, for Discovery Tour, ancient Greece or, you know, ancient Egypt, having those same expectations met about what life was like in those eras. And, you know, players, and you can see this in the YouTube comments for History Respawn, players get upset when their historical expectations are not met. They don't like surprises.
It's true, right? And there is a very fine line, I think, that you walk on this sort of thing. Right? What's fascinating, though, is that, like, I cannot think of another context wherein which you would get to play just straight up a monk.
Yeah.
And there's some interesting hidden elements to who this monk is. You know, there's sort of veiled references to his father and stuff, and clearly it is very unusual that this is his first day as a monk, as the narration says. Right? Because this is a dude who's clearly at least in his 20s. Like, most monks, especially in this period, are starting as child oblates. So they're starting as like 5-year-olds who are put into monastic care and then spend their whole lives there. Right? Or they join pretty late in life. That's another sort of common practice.
Yeah.
You know, but at the same time, like, when else have you ever gotten to play a video game where you say the Our Father, the, you know, Pater Noster in Latin, a monastery? That's kind of a wild departure from expectation, and it's really interesting.
And, you know, this might be dumb for some viewers, but one of my big criticisms of the previous versions of Discovery Tour was the fact that you couldn't participate in things like this. So you could go up to where NPCs were acting out, you know, some kind of historical process. You know, like the famous one I can think of is making a mummy in Discovery Tour, ancient Egypt. And I was sitting there, you know, a few years ago saying, oh, I wish I could be an NPC and actually participate in that. And so here we've got, you know, near the beginning of this Discovery Tour where you can participate in monastic prayer. And then later on when you're playing as Thornstein, you can actually go through the process of helping to build your longship. And
which I thought was really cool.
Yeah. And so that's, I know a lot of players would find that really banal and dumb, but for me, I think that is where this Discovery Tour idea can really succeed. Is, you know, I think about this all the time when going through museums with students, is any kind of moment where you can get students hands-on with the past and, you know, in particular working out some sort of you know, historical process, or, you know, going to like a what's it called, you know, going to historical reenactments or going to a pioneer farm or something like that. Those really have a powerful impact on education. And so I feel like this kind of Discovery Tour, you know, playing out these historical processes, you know, monastic prayer, building a longship, that could have the same sort of effect on knowledge.
Yeah. I think it would need to hit earlier than college.
Yeah.
I have a hard time seeing how I would use this functionally in a college context, and that's true for a couple of reasons. I've talked about this with like my department chair. Like, getting people access to something like Assassin's Creed Valhalla is a big ask.
Yeah.
Not that it's any more expensive than like the textbooks that the science department has people buy.
Shots
but,
fired.
like, hey, I am resolutely proud of my ability to get people 4 books for under $100. But but you need a computer that could play it.
Yeah.
So it's hard to say like use this as your reading source instead of reading X, Y, or Z.
Yeah. And I think, I think that price thing, that's kind of a big barrier.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of the price and the tech, right? Like, I know somebody at University of Denver who does video game stuff, and he has people play World of Warcraft because it's you can play it basically on anything.
Yeah.
You can play it on like an Amiga from like 1985 or something. But like at the same time, like conceptually, that was a terrible monastery. This is a terrible monastery, and I mean that in the most like non-historical. Like, these monks are bad at their jobs, and this monastery is being run very shoddily. There's way too many people just wandering around. There's like that mass. If that was supposed to be mass, it was like terribly run. There was a woman with her sleeves showing. Like, what kind of monastery is who's in charge here? But that's actually really interesting because it gets at like those expectations again. Like,
yeah, exactly.
How do you make something that reads as Christian mass? Because functionally speaking, what these monks would be doing in the 9th century would look so different from what a Catholic is doing now. Like, to the point where it would be in some ways just indistinguishable from like magic or whatever. Like, it would be really hard to read, even though the liturgy in some ways has a lot of overlap.
I will find a way to ease your pain.
But you want it to be readable, and so they're all at pews, for instance.
Yeah.
And they're all sort of individually praying. There should be like all kinds of like group prayer stuff going on instead. And everybody's just sort of wandering around because you want to make it lived in, right?
Yes.
But monasteries were incredibly rigidly sort of run. So it's interesting to think about. Like, on the other hand, like how realistic is creating your image of a monastery from a bunch of performative texts that provide normative information, right? Information about what it should be like. Maybe this is more realistic.
Yeah.
Because humans are humans, right? So it makes for some really interesting conversation, which I think is cool.
Yes. And, I think with regards to the technological barrier, the price barrier, I think in some ways, it's not as compelling, but you could always direct students to videos like this. You could always, have them watch Let's Plays videos. I mean, there are ways to get to this content, but I feel like, the best way to get to it is to actually play it yourself.
Can you do me a favor? Can you go to the map for a second?
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to just highlight something I think is hilarious about this whole thing. Can you click on the Eagle fast travel and fast travel over to that? Do you see where I'm talking
this
about?
One?
Over to the, sort of to the, that one.
This one? Okay.
Yeah. Because I did that and something hilarious happened that I just wanted to see if it happens again.
Okay. I can't wait. I'm very excited now.
Yes, this is exactly it, right? Like, this is what happens when you try to like shoehorn in your monk story into the existing world of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, because now our little Nebuchadnezzar monk is perched on top of this Roman statue pillar, like an assassin, and I love it.
Well, Daniel, didn't you know he's a championship diver as well?
Yes, right. Like, that was his previous life as an Olympic diver. I had to just pull that up because it is like a funny little, like, for all the intent, like there are moments where it breaks down in some fascinating ways.
Yeah.
But technically, when you go on free roam, you can switch your character to whoever you want, I think.
Yes.
And there's some fun gamification things where you unlock more portraits and stuff.
That's right. Yeah, and so it gives you kind of a compelling reason to keep playing if you're into to what they call skins or not. I always feel dirty when I actually say that word out loud, but that's what people refer to them as. So, anyways,
and it is funny, right? Like, I found it more interesting than following the quests was to really like chase down all the little tidbits of knowledge. And
Yeah,
that, I think, is one of the reasons I've never finished this game, is because I get so, I have a hard time not doing the 100% completion, find all the things and stuff.
So yeah, let's take a moment and look at the Codex here. Maybe we'll wrap up here today with this. So this is the Codex. This is the collection of all of the little markers that you run into, and they're divided into different categories. So you've got war and politics, daily life, religion and magic, myth and legends, science, law and justice, art and culture, trade and economy. And then also you've got the behind the scenes sections, and these are broken down by research and then different areas of the world, and then kind of different topics. So immersion is a topic here, and so for all of these you can go through and you can reread segments that you have come across, and then also re-listen to some of those behind the scenes audio entries as well. So. Yeah.
And it's interesting because it is kind of a weirdly mixed bag to a certain extent. Some of the Codex entries are really good. Some of them are just okay. Some of them you're sort of like, okay, whatever. And they all aim, like the Harold Fairhair one is pretty great for saying right from the get-go, I think it's as fabulous as it is dubious, right? Because Harold Fairhair is very fundamentally kind of a mythic figure. He's very like Arthurian in some ways. There's very little to sort of document him in the contemporary historical record, but he looms so large in Norwegian and Icelandic and Viking Age history that it's impossible to not have him be central. So it's nice that they mention that. On the other hand, they don't talk at all about what the sagas are, right? Which is something that I would have wanted to see.
Or maybe even, and I'm sure they've got an entry for sagas, maybe even having a kind of a link here to another entry that you've come across. Now, I could understand maybe if you haven't come across that yet, they wouldn't link that, but I don't know. I think it would be a small step to say, oh, if there is an entry on sagas, put it somewhere down here so you can be like, oh, or even link text within this entry.
That's something I found very oddly missing, was like, where's a beautiful pull quote here?
Yeah.
I wanted pull quotes for basically all of this stuff, which is something I'm always yelling at my students about, right? Like when you make a claim, throw something really shiny and impressive in there.
Yeah.
And to a certain extent, they do that with the images, but like, it's also clear that like sometimes they're like, oh, we need an image here. And I feel this very strongly, like as someone who designs PowerPoints for a living, like sometimes you need an image and you're like, okay, I'm going to use, the Sutton Hoo helmet, even though that's not Viking Age.
Oh, I know.
Because
I run into the same problem with, recently I was teaching the 30 Years War, and it's like, with the 30 Years War, there's actually not that many great images or maps. So it's like, okay, well, I'll just kind of throw in this vaguely early modern map image and painting from the 17th century, and just hopes this works. Nobody's going to call me out on it, but yeah.
Well, right. Like I would have wanted a quote from like the Battle of Maldon or Beowulf, something, or a skaldic poem here. Just to really give it a little bit more oomph. So it's interesting that they don't have their primary sources on display, and maybe it's a reading thing. Maybe it's just getting access to translations and licensing, that sort of thing. I don't know, but that was something I found kind of interesting, is that they don't do that. They have lots of beautiful images, but not very much text at all.
Yeah. Well, and I'm sure this is the third iteration of Discovery Tour, I would imagine, for whatever new Assassin's Creed comes out there. They'll probably do this again. And maybe they'll take some of our advice to improve it. I'm going to take credit for it because nobody else will. I feel like they listened to me when it came to doing the NPC actions for this version. So maybe the developers will watch this and kind of get some ideas. And I am curious, though. I kind of talked about this in a previous video on Discovery Tour. I do wonder what kind of business this is doing for them. I mean, because this is Ubisoft is
Right.
not doing this for free, and I'm still just curious as what kind of adoption rate they are looking for, maybe from schools or from universities. What is success in this regard, for Discovery Tour? I have no idea.
Yeah, I wonder how much of it is performative, in as much as like if you're making the claim to be the premier historical video game makers, there's a little bit of like put your money where your mouth is, sort of like. So maybe the corporate benefit of it is the display of sort of bona fides, as it were.
Yes.
Like that's an interesting idea.
Yeah. But I feel like there are much less expensive ways to do that kind of work. That's what I keep coming back to. It's like, the work they've done here, it is based on the game that they created, the environments they created already. But this is a lot of work. Like, this is a lot of work even just to make this mode. And so, I agree wholeheartedly with what you're saying, but at the same time, I feel like other history game developers get away with being recognized as legitimate history without having to do all of this. Yeah. So I don't know. Maybe there's a tax deduction they're getting from that. That could be. I have no idea.
Yeah, and I wonder if to a certain extent it's also a flex of sorts.
Yeah.
To demonstrate, their place in these things. Yeah, it's hard to know, right? Like, I think I will almost certainly use this content in my class. It's very hard for me to imagine ever trying to convince DU that, we should spend money on it.
Yes.
But again, it's not clear to me that this is necessarily for college students even.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think it might work better in a high school context, maybe.
Yeah.
And again, it's hard. It's a step, right? But like, I feel like this is the sort of thing where I would get students who did this and then they'd take my Viking class and I'd actually find it a little bit annoying because they know things, but not context exactly.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, again, like, it makes for really interesting conversations. There is at no point in this whole thing do you see the correct ship that anybody would be sailing in, because they wouldn't be sailing in long ships, because long ships are for raiding, not for settling, right? But of course, that's not what you want from your Vikings.
Yeah.
So like, fine, that's totally cool. That makes for really interesting conversation.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether Ubisoft is like interested in the meta conversation.
Now,
I think they might be, because they did put all of these
without an awesome
things, right?
ship. It's the law. After all, Norsemen are
There's that
renowned
cheekiness.
for their boat-building craftsmanship to this day. To do it justice, modelers in Montreal built the dimensions and shapes, while artists in Singapore created 48 different variations of longboats with stunning designs inspired by Norse mythology. The outcome speaks for itself. A slick, clinker-built hull for hydrodynamism, shallow keels to sail in low
That's going to
waters,
be a vocab word.
You run into some fun
removable
little,
mast to pass
like
under
game
bridges.
engine things where
Now
suddenly you're
set
skipping
sail.
across the water
May
like a
you have
stone,
fair winds and
which is
following
kind of
seas.
hilarious.
Don't forget your sandwiches.
That bottom image is closer to like what you'd see, because it's a little bit of a wider hull. But like, they would have had cattle and livestock, and they certainly wouldn't have been sailing out in the middle of winter, which of course Norway is all winter, so you basically perforce have to. But again, like, I don't think that makes this a bad game or even a bad history game, right? It makes, but then it makes you have to define what a history game is. Yeah. Which I think is really interesting.
Yeah.
A history game is not history.
Yeah.
So, then you get to have conversations about what it is and why it exists, and it makes for some fascinating stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think that's all the time we have. Daniel, thank you so much for joining me for this live stream on Discovery Tour.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure.